This is a post-Christian podcast.
Welcome to the Revolution Church podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Revolution. Hello, Facebook Live again, our second Facebook Live. We've got our friend Angel gave us a lovely, what do they call these things? Tripod. So now we have a tripod so I can look into your eyes. And, feel self-conscious about myself being on camera again because I haven't sat in front of a camera in a long time. But that's okay. It just makes me feel better. I'll just work through it. I'm going to have to get a makeup artist and do makeup before service. Well, we are going through Galatians right now. We are in Galatians 2, so turn your pages to Galatians 2, or your phones, or your computers. I was really tempted today to maybe do a different talk, and I might wind some of that into this. So I was thinking today about doing a talk about dealing with social media, because this past week, my dad said something about Donald Trump, and Twitter went crazy. And my dad was trending, and my mom was trending. And I didn't look up. I didn't hit on the trending things only because some people already told me that people are saying nice, nasty things about my mom, and I can't stand that. And I grew up with that, I grew up going as a kid going to the mall and seeing people wearing T-shirts that said I ran into Tammy Faye in the mall with this makeup splat on the front, and she thought they were hilarious and would sign them. But when you're a kid, it's kind of hard to decipher those things, what's good and what's bad. But it was interesting because a lot of this stuff started with this group called Christian Right Watch. And so it's a really weird road to walk down when you have the experience of having your family say something that you don't maybe not necessarily agree with. I don't watch my dad's show. I've never seen it. I've been on it years ago. Our staff used to take retreats up there. But I haven't ever watched the show or watched clips of the show. So it was weird. It's just weird. And it was weird that colleagues of mine were posting this thing, and you kind of go like, and, they're like, well, you're a public person and you have to accept that. And your dad's a public person and you have, all that stuff. And like, okay, I get it. I accept it. But it's not, it still doesn't make it easy, and then you see people making just really mean comments, and being like, and then some other progressive person put together a video, a bunch of clips of different evangelicals saying, I guess, positive things about Trump, and then put in a clip of my dad. And from what I understand, the clip was actually taken him out of context. With one of my buddies called me and was like, why did they use that clip? Because they probably could have gotten a clip of your dad saying something positive about Trump, but they used a clip that wasn't even in context. And so I contacted the person who made it and said, hey, I'm sure you could find a clip in context. Only because if we're going to bring things forward and we're going to be socially conscious, if we're progressives or socially conscious, maybe we should use things that are right. And it's lazy. And I think there's a lot of laziness in how we argue with each other. Honestly, I think social media is often a very lazy way to make political points. Because I think I'm going to get on the soapbox. I'm going to try not to do this, and I'm going to try to get into Galatians really fast. But I think if we look like at Nelson Mandela or Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. and people like that, you saw people who those are my heroes. And those are the guys that went to the politicians. Some of them became politicians, but they went to the politicians and had conversations, and they made differences, and they made changes. I don't know what they would be like if they would have had social media. But they made a difference through having hard conversations. And I think some of the people online were like, you need to denounce your father, and you need to denounce what he says, and you need to do this, and like I have to earn my liberal badge or something. And I was like, in my mind I'm going like, you guys, I don't talk to my dad that very often, but when I do, we talk about this stuff. And I'd much rather sit down with him and have a conversation with him than write some stupid tweet that causes us to never talk again. And love is a complicated thing. People talk about love in the Bible, and loving other people doesn't mean you necessarily agree with them. That's why it says love doesn't demand its own way in Corinthians 13. It's saying, sometimes you have to sit down and have hard conversations, and relationships are tough. Every form of love and relationships are tough. So that's a tough road to haul. But maybe I think it's something better for me to write about and than tweet about. So that's what I'm going to try to do, is write about it and see if we can learn to empathize with others, even when they don't agree with us. Because I'm afraid that we're going to just start scapegoating others. And it's really easy to do that. And I think to sum everybody up and say, well, this person voted this way, so they must be this way, I think is dangerous and very judgmental, and it's not really thinking. We should think better. We should argue better. We should sit down and talk with one another. Not everybody can do that, and I get that, but I think that's where real change comes from. At least that's what I've learned from my studies of nonviolence and in my own personal relationships. So take that for what it's worth, and we'll do it. All right. Oh, what are we going to do? Be a human being today. Galatians. So here we are in Galatians again with the Apostle Paul. And Paul is writing this letter to his church in Galatians because they are, or the Gauls, because they are returning to the law, because they are leaving grace, because they are being pressured to be circumcised. They're being pressured to do certain things that are religious tradition. I saw a tweet the other day, or an Instagram, that said tradition is peer pressure from dead people. I thought that was pretty cool. So it's Paul is confronting these folks because he went there and he started a church and he felt like they grasped the ideas of grace and the concept. And so he's kind of laying out a case for himself of saying, like, remember me, I'm good enough, I'm an apostle too, because the people are saying he's not a real apostle. So he's kind of like defending himself. And it's really strange to have one of the greatest books on grace be a total letter of rebuke at the same time. So, but that's a contradiction of life. That's a contradiction that Hegel talks about, and seeing who you really are. And I love that. I love the fact that we just are so full of contradictions, and that it's very clear in the Bible, and you can grasp humanity here. And today we're going to be looking at a lot of humanity in Galatians. So, let's start in Galatians 2. It says, here Paul is still laying out his case for being, a real apostle. He says, then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking along Titus along with me. I went up in response to his revelation. Then I laid before them, though only a private meeting with them to acknowledge leaders. I like how he puts that in there. The gospel that I proclaim amongst the Gentiles. So he wanted to go to the leaders and say, this is what I'm talking about. I'm reaching out to the Gentiles. Which was not seen as acceptable because Christianity was starting to be looked at as a form of Judaism, and Gentiles were not welcomed. And Paul, who is like the Pharisee of Pharisees and the total, probably one of the most Jewish out of them, is coming in and going, no, we're going to reach Gentiles. We're going to go global. And it says, in order to make sure that I was running or I had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not compelled to be circumcised, though he was Greek. But because of the false believers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus, so they might enslave us. So we did not submit to them even for a moment, so the truth with the gospel might always remain with you. And this is interesting because basically what he's saying is someone came into where we were bathing or changing or something to spy on to see if Titus was circumcised or not. Interesting. Christians have kind of, it's funny, it made me think about when Jimmy Swaggart had his fall. The reason he got caught doing what he was doing was because another preacher who didn't like him hired a private investigator to follow him around and take pictures to see what he was up to. So, isn't that fun? Christianity at its best. But you see that it's nothing new under the sun. I mean, they've been doing this forever. It's like, let's go spy on Paul and his friends, and then we'll bring this up to Peter and James and John and all those guys and see what they say when we go like, oh, but one of his guys isn't circumcised, But what I love that Paul says here is he's like, we weren't going to be made slaves. They can't enslave us into religion. And I think a good litmus test in religion is, we should probably get a computer in here so we can see when the Facebook drops or not. But I think a good idea of getting away from religion, seeing toxic religion, is when it makes you feel like you're a slave. When you feel like you're having to do things that are beyond your nature, when it is forcing you to do things like that. Now, I believe growth is important in faith, and over time we learn to love, and we learn to love even more, and love even more radically, and we grow in that. Loving your enemy is not easy. It's the toughest thing I've ever done, is loving my enemies. I think maybe what's a little bit tougher is loving other people's enemies, because then you kind of slowly become enemies to them. Heck, it's hard enough for me just to love my own father in the public without people telling me no, or putting a big asterisk by the love and trying to explain to me what I can say and what I can't say. That's what I love about punk rock, because it's like, piss off, I'll say what I want to say, and I'm glad to listen to what you have to say, but I've got punk rock life. So I'm not necessarily going to listen. I'm going to live my best life. And hey, guess what? You don't have to listen, and you don't have to buy the books, and you don't have to do those things. I'm always intrigued by people because they get so mad, and I'm like, well, just turn it off, man. The fact that we use people like Franklin Graham and Jerry Falwell Jr., my dad, and other folks like that as examples, I'm like, I feel like they're kind of preaching to the choir, and I kind of feel like when we're using those extreme examples, we're preaching to the choir. It's like, that's not, I think there might be other people who are a little bit more threatening than the obvious, I don't know. See, I'm going back to the other sermon that I wanted to preach, because I'm a preacher, and that's what we do. We just preach what we want to preach, even though we're doing a Bible study. Sorry, guys. We're going to get back to Galatians. So he says, even for a moment, we weren't going to let them enslave us, so that the truth of the gospel might always remain with you. So he was like, we are going to make our freedom known. We're not going to let this bother us, and we don't want the gospel to be polluted. We don't want to be polluted by the law. We don't want it to be polluted by that. We are taking these traditions and saying they were good for a time, but they don't exist anymore because we're under grace. We're not under law. We don't have to do these things anymore. And unfortunately, the church wants to rebuild these old laws or these ideas, and maybe not even laws from Judaism, but laws that we create, like you have to vote this way. You have to act this way. You can't listen to this type of music. You have to do this certain type of thing, or you're not really a Christian. Grace always really confuses everybody because grace says you are accepted. I mean, Paul Tillich's talk on acceptance is brilliant, and I highly recommend it. It's in a book called Shaking the Foundations. But there's no requirement in that to believe more or to do more or to do, and that's why I think we fear grace so much, is because, they didn't like this because they wanted to control this guy and have him circumcised so he would be one of them and look like one of them. We do the same things as where we want people to look like us and kind of think like us and vote like us and have the same belief system, or that's not even the word I'm looking for, is convictions. Everybody share our convictions. And that's just not how humanity works. That's not how life works, because we were all grown up in different situations, different backgrounds, believing different things for different reasons. And that's why it's interesting, like why we should communicate more, is because when we communicate with one another, we learn about each other's lives. We hear each other's life stories, and we grow from that. That's why books are so interesting, is because you're reading from people with different perspectives than yours, and you can grow from that. Mark Maron used to say that every book becomes a self-help book. And I feel that way sometimes, even like when I read books, like I'm like, I know I disagree with this person, but I'm like, when I'm in it, I'm like, maybe, I can get why they think this, based on what they've decided to believe or their theology that they've subscribed to, and have a little bit more empathy, but also look and be like, oh, well, this is how I talk to somebody who thinks that way. Always looking at different angles where we communicate with people. And this is one of my favorite parts in Galatians, is it goes, okay, in 6, he goes, and now those who are supposed to be acknowledged leaders, because he's talking about those who are trying to expose them, he goes, what they actually were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Now it's in italics because, he's just putting that in there, but I like the idea that it says God shows no partiality. And I really like this when I was fighting against legalism and this idea of the religion, conservative Christianity when I was younger, because I was like, see, God has no favorites. There is no special man of God, and I really liked this. And I'm like, and even Paul said that, And now I find it like I'm having to say it to my progressive brothers and sisters as well. There is no super chosen one. God has no favorites. Because we want to just be we kind of focus on, oh no, this guy's really got it, and this one doesn't quite have it, and who's God's favorite? God doesn't show partiality, and I think that's really interesting when you've been raised to think that way. These leaders contributed nothing to me. Paul really goes hard here. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter, making him an apostle to the circumcised, also worked through me in sending me to the Gentiles. So once again, we see Paul, the apostle, is laying out his whole, his defense again. He's like, hey, just as much as Peter is an apostle to the Jews, I'm an apostle to the Gentiles. He's defending himself. Pure humanity there. Then he goes on to say, and when James and Cephas and John, who are acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, which I guess maybe a handshake or something, or a secret handshake, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and to the circumcised. They asked to reach Gentiles and the circumcised, so both forms of the faith. Then he asked only one thing, that we remember the poor, which I was actually what I was very eager to do. So the poor, once again, it's like, don't forget about the poor. These religious sects and stuff that you're dealing with and arguing with are important, but don't forget what's really important. Don't forget the poor. Don't forget to help those in need. And I think a lot of us are driven to that by that very concept of reaching the poor. But sometimes to the point where we get the religious politics back in it again. So it's like this really vicious cycle where we're constantly battling our human nature to because we want these rules and we want these regulations. I mean, this is why the people were bringing back in Judaism because it's comfortable. Legalism is comfortable because it tells you what to do. You know, I have a lot of doubt in my life and my belief system. And, you know, there are times where I miss certainty. You know, like, I know that I know that I know, you know, God said it, the Bible put it, you know, and so it's true, you know, and I miss certainty, you know. I mean, there's a reason people are addicted to certainty. You know, they have this compulsion to be like, I know, you know, and why people write books on apologetics and things like that, because it makes us feel secure. And security is a nice feeling to have, you know, safety and secure. But, you know, that also makes us often closed to the other. And that's what I hope we're not, closed to the other. This is where it gets really cool. This is the best part of Galatians, I think, or the most, you get to see the humanity of all the apostles here. And Paul really lays down his argument right here in 11 to 14. He says, but when Cephas, talking about Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. Now, Paul's really been hitting on this self-condemned thing. He's like, cursed is anyone who preaches a different message. He's talking about a self-curse. He's also saying they're condemning themselves through these actions. For until certain people came from James, so he uses James's group. I wrote about this in one of my books, my last book, I think it was. Came from James. He used to eat with the Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back out of fear and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. That's going to be the name of my next punk band, the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas, who's his buddy, was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, through a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? So he's showing us like even when Peter made this mistake, even when Peter, the rock of the church went back to the law, I had to correct him. Because this is how important grace is. He's also showing that he's like an apostle. He's like, see, I corrected Peter, so I'm an apostle. You know what I mean? He's showing his, who he really is and showing that he's got his shit together and that he's important too. We get it, Paul. You're important. But this idea that James's folks, and this seems to be an interesting thing that he goes through the New Testament, is that James and Paul seem to kind of not see eye to eye on Christianity. Like Paul's like, some of these people who are putting your mind and twisting it with these messages of, you could do whatever you want, and then Paul, you see Paul kind of dealing with it. So you see that there was always an uncomfortable question about what the faith really was, and these guys are trying to figure it out, and people always disagreed. They always weren't sure. They always argued theology. Arguing theology is a great tradition of our faith, especially in the Jewish tradition. And they argued well. They didn't say Paul shouldn't be an apostle, or he wasn't like, James should just be done and we should get rid of James because he's Jesus' brother and he thinks he's all that. Let's just, fire him or have him stoned or whatever. No, he didn't do any of that. He's just saying, I had to disagree because, James's folks is having a bad influence on people. He's scaring people and intimidating them. He's intimidating Peter. He's intimidating Barnabas, my first person with me. And you could read this in all sorts of different ways if you really wanted to think about it. Let's have fun with this for a second, or try to have fun with it. But Cephas came to Antioch and opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James's, he used to eat with the Republicans. But after that, he came and drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the progressives. And the others, conservatives, joined him in this hypocrisy. So then even Barnabas led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw this, They were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel. I said, Cephas, before them all, if you thought you live like the liberal or whatever, or a conservative, live like that. Don't compel these people to have to be this other thing. Now, I know that's ridiculous and a little far-fetched, because I could reverse it around, too, and say, he sat with the liberals. You could use this on either side, because we're so divided as a church right now. We're so divided as a country right now. And this idea of dualistic thinking has actually got me kind of creeped out, that we have to just be like, I'm this or I'm that. It's like, maybe I'm neither one of those things, And I think what Paul is saying with grace and the idea of grace is that you can just be. You don't have to separate. You can be with the Jewish Christians. You can be with the Gentile Christians, and you guys can live together. Now, my only thing is if you're doing these traditions to be saved, you're missing the point. There's nothing wrong with these traditions. There's nothing wrong of thinking this way, but it's when your thinking is cast onto other people saying that they have to do it in order to be real believers, that's when I have an issue. When it has to be gospel. But he's saying we can live in community together. There's no reason, even if you want to continue to have circumcision in your faith and in your life, but there's no reason to compel the Gentiles to do it. It's pretty interesting that he's saying, there's going to be diversity in our community, but real diversity. And people are afraid of real diversity. We want like, oh, cool, hippie kind of diversity, but we just like when someone comes in and harshes our mellow, we want them out. We fear diversity, or we fear inclusion. No one is truly inclusive. Not no one. I'm sure there are really inclusive people out there, but we fear, we want to be inclusive of these people and these people and these people and these people. But Jay, I'm sorry, don't bring your dad. And if you're going to have a picture of your dad, with you, could you just at least explain that you don't agree with him and make that clear? I'm like, well, have you ever heard any of my sermons and heard any of his sermons? I mean, are you familiar with my work at all? Am I denouncing this for strangers who haven't heard my work or just heard his work or just, well, I don't know what I'm doing here anymore, So inclusion means sitting down with your enemies and sharing meals and talking to them. Now, I also agree with Tupac, who said, just because I don't like you or you're my enemy doesn't mean I hate you and doesn't want you to eat. It just doesn't mean I want to sit at the same table with you. So I get that. We don't have to be like Jesus right away. Maybe be like Tupac first, and then see if we can be more Jesus-y later down the road. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that it's interesting. And I love the fact that Paul confronts Peter, and it seems that this worked out. It's interesting. Okay, so that was my favorite part of one of my favorite parts of Galatians. Not my very favorite part, but I'm going to say that a lot when we go through this. Like, oh, here's my favorite part. So I'm just going to say this is one of my favorite parts. Let's go on and share a little bit more, and I'll try to make this quick. We ourselves are Jew by birth and not Gentile sinners. Well, thanks, Paul. That was a little harsh. Yet we know that a person is justified not by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. And we have come to believe in Christ Jesus so that we might be justified by faith in Christ. So this is a lot of people's very traditional understanding of Christianity. My Christianity is the way I feel about Christ and Jesus is a little bit different, but I'll talk about that later. But he says, okay, so in Christ Jesus, so that we might be justified in faith in Christ, and not by doing the works of the law. Because no one will be justified by the works of the law. But if our efforts to be justified in Christ, we ourselves have been found to be sinners, is it Christ the servant of sin? Certainly not. But if I build up again the very thing that I once tore down, then I demonstrate that I am a transgressor. And what is Paul saying is if I build up the old system, if I go back to the law. And I think now one of the things we have to deal with in Christianity is we've been having to deal with for hundreds of years, if not thousands, is that we create new laws. We build new laws, we create old laws, and we make these litmus tests that say who's in and who's out. And all that is law. That is new law. That is what the law was there to separate us from each other. And you'll see as we get further into Galatians that there is no separation in Paul's mind anymore. It's very radical grace. It's very radical inclusion. I think Paul's still really into atonement theory because of his understanding of how that works, but I think it has a lot to do with tradition and stuff. And I think we'll get into that a little bit more in the next couple weeks. But I just want to focus on this. So he's saying, don't rebuild the old system. That's when I find out that I've messed up. Don't recreate new systems. Don't be guardians at the gate. And everybody has these guardians at the gate. I left conservative evangelicalism because I felt like everybody was grace monitors. Who gets grace, or hall monitors. You know what I mean? And it was like this special club that you had to believe certain things and do certain things in order to be included in. And if you didn't live up to their standards, you were done. I mean, when I watched my parents do all this good stuff. Evangelicals loved my parents. It seemed like everybody wanted to be on the couch to be interviewed by my parents. And then everybody found out they weren't perfect and their ministry fell apart. Everything fell apart. And then I just watched people scatter and go away. I didn't see grace there. I saw something that says, oh, you're only going to be good for us if you're perfect, or at least have the illusion that you're perfect, and we don't know that you're not. Because if you're really human, you know that everybody has questions and suffers and things like that. I mean, not everybody knows that, but you do learn that over time as you live, is that humans are really human. I once had someone explain to me as being very haphazardly human. And I didn't know what to think when I first heard that. And now I take it as a huge compliment. But yeah, so they saw humanity, they saw sin, they saw this and said, you're not welcome here, so you're done. We're done with you, and we're going to preach against you and make jokes about you. And the mainliners already didn't agree with my family, so they did that, And it's funny because I've met hundreds of pastors like, oh, we cared about your, this, or why didn't your parents do this, or why didn't your parents do that? Why is your dad this way? And I'm speaking from personal experience today. If you don't like it, I'm sorry. You just took that off, or you can walk out the door. Part of me was like, he had 5 years, especially with pastors. I'm like, you could have visited my dad because you're a pastor, no matter if you want, whenever you wanted to. He was in Rochester, Minnesota, in a prison. You could have come out and gave him a visit and talked to him. And I said to somebody the other day, I'm like, I always kind of hoped secretly that my mainline denomination friends would just swoop in when my dad got out of prison and just kind of embrace him, But nobody really embraced him when he got out of prison, and he just kind of lived his life. He actually was very liberal when he got out of prison, which is a shock to some people. But what happened was the people that he used to know started to bring him back in, slowly but surely. It is what it is. I don't know. I've got no real concern at this point. I'm just going to live my life the best I can. But the idea is that we rebuild these laws, we rebuild these systems, and that's when we become transgressors, is when we put on these who is welcomed into the kingdom of God and who is not. I think that's one of the reasons I have a big issue when I see people writing articles or things like this of saying, you can't be a real Christian unless A, B, C. Or you can't be a real Christian and support A, B, C. Because I'm like, well, that's not even theologically sound. Roman, all sin, all fall short, all of God's gracious kindness. And it says we'll be known for our love for one another, but that includes our enemies. So really it's like, well, then should I say that people who don't really love their enemies or love others' enemies, they're not really, I just don't feel like it's up to us to say who's in and who's out. Honestly, I don't really think it's ultimately about that, but that's what we're dealing with here in the book of Galatians. 19 says, for through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. So Paul is literally saying, I died with Christ. I shared that moment of suffering. I shared that moment of abandonment. And really focusing on understanding the idea of crucified with Christ has really helped me, especially after reading my buddy Pete's book about the idea that Jesus felt abandoned by God. Because I felt that so many times, and I've used that for reasons to be like, I don't believe in this shit anymore. I'm done. I don't know what to do. But then I've realized so many times that it was like even Jesus felt abandoned. That helps me out a little bit. and my to relate to someone like Jesus. And it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, I who loved me and gave himself for me. And then this is really pretty cool part. Get ready. Hold on, everybody. For the justification comes through... Oh, no, he says, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if justification comes through the law, then Christ died for nothing. So in Paul's mind was, if we go through all these rules and regulations, then there is no need for Jesus to die. Because he believes that because of Jesus' death, we had grace. I believe Jesus came to show us that we've always had grace and that we just never really grasped it. This is my theology. But Paul is saying, because Paul is a firm believer in atonement theory, is that if if we rebuild the law, when we try to do things, when we put these expectations on, there's no need for Jesus anymore. There's no need for the Sermon on the Mount. There's no need for loving your enemy or new to your neighbor or doing all those stories, everything that Jesus did. There's no point in it if we're going to rebuild the law, if we're going to create new laws, if we're going to say that you have to be A, B, or C in order to fit in. And I've seen this my whole life growing up. And it breaks my heart a little bit that I'm starting to see it out of the liberal side and the progressive side, because that was something that was a group that I always felt I thought was much safer, to be honest with you. And now I'm starting to realize it's not as safe. I'm rethinking where I stand in my life because of that, because I'm like, I don't know if this is something that I can, hitch on to anymore. I feel like if I want to remain inclusive, I can't just be on this side and exclude those people as they did to me years ago. I just don't think exclusion is the way to go. I don't think new rules and regulations that look more like me are the way to go. And making feel people like they're guilty or not included because they don't live up to my expectations. I'm just returning the favor that happened to me when I was a kid. I'm just creating a new form of legalism. And I don't want to be in that. So I don't want to rebuild the law. I don't want to build a new law. We've got a law, and this time it's Law 2.0, and it is so much better, and it is so cool, You can drink and hang out, and our law is really cool. You just can't be a bummer, man. I don't know. That's my impersonation of some guy. I don't know who. But I don't know. I just hope we can think this through and think about how we look at inclusion, if we truly want to be inclusive, or if we just really want to be legalistic in a different sense. And who is our other? Who is the other in your life? If you spend your life working with the poor and helping the poor, I will tell you this, they are no longer the others. Someone else becomes your other. So who is the other? Often the other is those that you don't want to be around. And what someone said, if your enemies look like, the thing I have a problem with Christians is that often their enemies are, their enemies look a lot like God's enemies, And so it's we just decide where we're at in our life, oh, okay, I'm here. So now God doesn't like these people. That's a new law. That's just, we're falling into something. I think the idea and the journey of Christianity is saying we go beyond that. We build above that. We go into this complete inclusion where we really do love people, where we really do have the tough conversations, where we do walk through life together, and we recognize each other's humanity and brokenness, that we all fall short. Not that some of us do, but that we all do. And so I think reason Paul's saying this is just he is saying this. He's don't create a law that excludes the Gentiles. Don't exclude these folks. And if someone comes in and saying they exclude these folks, I'm not going to listen to them. If you want to exclude the Gentiles, I'm not going to tolerate the exclusion of the Gentiles. But then when we get into it further, he's going to say there is neither Jew nor Gentile, nor male nor female. I'm jumping ahead of myself here, but he's going to go in and say that there's no status, there's no one special. He just said that about Peter just a second ago and said, God has no favorites. Nobody's special. Nobody's particular. Nobody's chosen. You know, empathy is a really hard thing. Reading the scriptures are really tough. It's really challenged me a lot because I would have preferred to stay in my camp and be comfortable. But now it's pulling me out of my own safe space. Well, only because I realize it's not as safe as I thought it was. It's not as inclusive as I thought it was. You know, it looks really great and it looks like wokeness, but in some ways, now I have all these others now. You know, now I have a harder time. I can't forgive my enemies. I can't sit at the table with them anymore. You know, when Ellen DeGeneres sat next to George Bush, everybody lost their mind. She wasn't sitting down next to him going like, I agree with everything you did. She was at a party where he was at. She sat down and shared a talk, and he probably said something funny because she's Ellen, and he laughed, and people lost their minds. You say, well, Jay, he killed thousands of people. I'm like, well, any president has killed thousands of people. Even Obama, even Clinton, they've, killed thousands of people. That's what happens with presidents. That's why I can't put my faith in a president. That's why politicians aren't the people I choose to model my life after. I think we need politicians, but I'm just saying those aren't the folks. I follow the folks like Martin Luther King who challenged the politicians and made differences and changed a lot of those circumstances through having tough conversations, through putting their lives on the line, and through being very tolerant of their enemies. I like that. That's what I want out of my life. That's what I desire to follow. So, I think this book, as we go through Galatians, we're going to realize that there's a lot of inclusion, and it's a very uncomfortable book, and it leads us to not always be comfortable. And I think any faith that either tells you that you're going to be whole or complete or comfortable is just a lie. If you read any philosophy, you'll realize you're never whole or complete or comfortable. We have moments, and I love those moments. But life is a complicated journey. And, through my own mental health, I've realized that I have to accept some of those things. Life is complicated. And, people always say, Jesus is the answer. I'm like, might be the answer, but there's still a lot of questions that Jesus doesn't answer, and that Paul doesn't answer, and that the Bible doesn't answer, and that my faith doesn't answer, So, good luck with all that, folks. Hope you enjoyed that. We're going to do this is the part of the service where we let people do feedback. I'm going to try to read through here and see if you guys have any feedback. And, you took notes on the questions?
Yeah.
Oh, Caleb, always ahead of the game. Yes, all right. Well, Caleb's got the questions written down, so I'm not going to read your questions.
Yeah.
Except for the one that says "damn," such a good word. The whole sermon. I'll read that one. Okay.
So Greg, my dad, said to die to the law, to quit expecting yourself or your pastor to be perfect, to be human together. Yes, thank you.
Oh, that was nice.
Yeah. And then Pam said the other seems to be changing throughout my life. I think that's a really good point. That it sounds to me like she's kind of expressing that you don't reach a point where you've perfected it. It's why Christianity and religion in general is a practice, is because it is never completed. It's never accomplished. It's there's never we did it. We solved it.
Yeah,
solved Christianity.
Saw the internet.
Yeah. James says, I loved this. Amazing word, my friend. I felt every single word of this. You got a lot of positive feedback. Kim also gave some positive feedback and said, you are so awesome. Thank you for preaching the word. Lulu and I have been so blessed by your word today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you get Rocky?
I have
Glenn.
See, I have my phone isn't bringing his up anymore. I marked down to read his.
I'll read his real quick.
Yeah, you read his.
I can't see more because he wrote a long one, and for some reason,
Yeah, I don't know
my
what's
phone
going
will never
on
let
here.
me see more. So I'll just read what he did write. And he said, "Isn't it truly the reason so many freaking denominations? We all want to insist everyone about following what we believe." I don't know how much more there was to that, but that's all I can see. And I'm like, yeah. I mean, I would simplify it, but yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons we have denominations is because we couldn't agree. So he's like, I'm going to just start my own group. All right, we're going to open up the crowd here and for comments. Who's this short-haired Republican man here?
Yeah, the one thing that popped out to me was that Paul was getting spied on or infiltrated by false believers. But I liked how he said that they were trying to spy on the freedom that they have in Christ.
Yeah.
And I guess that kind of ties into when you were talking about in groups and out groups and not wanting to set that boundary. It sounds like Paul's setting the boundary at who is about freedom and who isn't about freedom. Because he calls them false believers and infiltrators, but they're not about freedom. And I think that might be a good way to set the boundary of in-group and out-group is, and not about if you should love them or not, but if they're on the right path or not, is like, are they about liberty? Are they about freedom? Or are they about like denying people the ability to have freedom?
Yeah.
And trying to stop that sort of thing. And I think you can find that in both the progressive movement and in the Republican movement. There are factions of people that are about freedom and liberty, and you can do the same thing in religious traditions as well. And sometimes you got to separate yourself from the people that aren't about liberty and freedom. And that's kind of what's going on with the United Methodist Church, which is the tradition I grew up in, is that they're deciding to split up and be like, well, some of us like freedom and you guys don't, so we're out. I think is how it's going down. I didn't really read a lot about it.
No, I mean, it's tough because, I don't think we should get rid of boundaries in our life. I'm not saying that we just get rid of boundaries and that we let everybody step over everybody. I mean, I'm not going to be like, I think it's cool you put kids in cages, or whatever. Like, I don't agree with it, so we can agree to disagree. No, I'm going to stand up and say something. I'm not saying we don't fight for injustice, but I think there's how we fight for injustice is what's important, And I think when we're fighting for this, like an overarch injustice of lots of people suffering, and then when we're dealing with individuals, I think that's truly how we deal with that, I just think we've got to make sure, and Paul does this. I mean, Paul really speaks firmly to people, harshly to people, and he seems to have his own in and out group. But I feel like he does it with the hope that everyone can live in harmony. He's not telling these guys like, you don't have to, you don't have to not believe in circumcision. He's like, but once you start telling other people that they have to believe A, B, or C, he's like, you're missing the point. And so that's where he's coming in. And I agree. I mean, I think that's why some of the people don't like my dad and stuff, because they think he's saying you have to be this, this, and this in order to be Christian, So they're speaking out against that. I get it. I just have a different sense from where I've come from in my own life and empathy for those type of people. I think it's a good thing, like saying, okay, legalistic people who don't want people to have freedom or don't want people to be able to be themselves, maybe they're missing the point. But I think there's a better way for us to tell them they're missing the point. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Or a better way to say you're rebuilding the law by not scapegoating them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Paul calls them false believers.
Yeah.
But maybe it'd be better to not write that down in a letter that's going to be in the most highest selling book in the world, but to talk to him in person and be like,
yeah, come on, Paul.
Hey, yeah.
Didn't you know Galatians was going to be a big jam? It's going to be Jay's favorite book.
Well, two things. I was thinking while you were talking about Paul as kind of like the Christian equivalent of an ACLU attorney.
Yeah.
Where he's fighting for the freedom of the out-group. and he's fighting to recognize the rights and the dignity of the out-group.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to say is that, and you did say this, but I was just going to put it in one sentence, that kind of the opposite of freedom is fear. And so, you know, if we look at people or look at ourselves and judge them and us as stubbornly clinging to our beliefs, that's because we're afraid. And somehow we have to find some kind of solace or hope and security in Christ and in our brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
So that we don't let fear determine how we live.
That's good. Yeah.
But I thought that was a beautiful talk. And very true and poignant and powerful.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you for that.
It's confusing. It's just a confusing world we live in, huh?
It is.
It's loud. I can contribute by saying I feel like I have mentioned this before, that I grew up in the Christian tradition. I grew up in a Baptist church and went to a Baptist school. And as an adult now, I feel like I'm relearning, or with fresh new eyes, learning the message of Christ in this whole new way. It's like this, it's a wonderful feeling to feel like it's like this new thing I'm discovering for the first time, actually, because I do have these stories from the past, but it's just learning it from through a new lens. And this is thanks for talking about Galatians today. One thing that I think is obviously very powerful, the grace, faith, and belief, and having those being driving forces, and having that be, that's it. It's not work. It's not what you do. It's not law. It's it's faith and grace. And I don't know what that means really, but that it's like a path. It's like something to follow and to learn from, and that's very powerful. And another thing I wanted to say is one thing that has changed with my understanding of Christ now, and this is just something that's come. It's just I know that this is how I understand Christ, is different from how I grew up, and how much of Christianity sees the message is in chapter 2. Paul says Jesus Christ is the only way. I think, right? Yes.
Yep.
And that's not my understanding, and I don't see that he is the only way. But what I want to say about that is that the message of Christ is so powerful, and I don't think that my understanding that that is not the only path diminishes the power of the message at all. That's how I don't see that as diminishing the message at all. But I do know that to me it feels like that's almost like a law or a rule that you would just follow this, that you just follow this one path and everybody else has to. It seems like it becomes violent then. So that's what I have to add. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I found the rest of those Facebook comments, if you want to hear those real quick here. Mary says, don't we have to step out of our comfort zone to truly love like God's love?
I mean, since I don't know what God is anymore, I'm not sure. Yeah. But
maybe like unconditional love might be a way to put that.
No, I mean, I think we have to step out of our comfort zone to love anybody. I think in friendship, in our children, in romantic relationships, I think that's always kind of, and that's the cool thing about love is sometimes when you love somebody, you see past their faults, or you accept those faults, or you see those as who they are, and you learn to embrace those things too, and love is such a strange thing on so many different levels. We actually probably need a few more words for love, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Paul's doing. I think Paul's just trying to say, like, look, we've gotten somewhere really cool where everybody's included, including Gentiles. Let's not miss this, and let's not force the Gentiles to jump through these hoops anymore. So the point is I don't know how much of it is personal responsibility too, is where we just watch our side of the road and we love other people, and I don't know. I've got too many things going on in my life right now to give the best, clearest opinion on this sermon.
And then I'll read one more here from our friend Ray. Said, I just lost it again. But the gist of it was, ever since leaving evangelicalism, I never thought that I would appreciate a sermon about Paul as much as I did this one. Something that he said. So
well, that's really cool.
Lots and lots of...
Somebody asked one of the books I recommended, and it was Shaking the Foundations by Paul Tillich.
Oh, yeah.
So there you go.
Uh-huh.
And then someone who mentioned that they are, as a person of color, man, I wish I could read more. I can't read more, and it drives me insane. It just says, inclusivity is some people's goal. I guess as a person of color, I relate to Malcolm X with the concepts that I want to help those, and then it just ends. I love Malcolm X. His book is one of my favorites, and the film they made about Malcolm X is one of my, probably, if not my very favorite film, in my at least top 5. No, I think Malcolm X got it right. I mean, I think at the end there, he really got it right, and it cost him his life, So I think Malcolm X is definitely someone to put into those roles of people who was impacting radical change.
I had one thought real quick, and this is something that you and I actually talked about earlier this week a little bit. Just incidentally, I've had conversations recently over the past week with some people who are definitely on different sides of, the social, political, kind of dichotomy, I guess. This created this manufactured A or B, kind of dichotomy that we find ourselves in. And I came to realize something, the way that I wrote this note down after thinking about it, is that it's not really about, and maybe I even sent this to you, Jay, but it's not really about the division.
You did send that to me.
Yeah. It's not about the division that's created and reinforced by these labels, by these manufactured labels like evangelical or progressive or conservative or liberal. It's really just, I think it's really more about, first, what makes sense to a person based on their own experience and their interactions. Like we've talked about before, the things that can change a person's perspective and even their convictions more than anything else, or how they see other groups of people, or how they see the other, is having those intimate reactions or interactions with those people and meeting those people and getting to know those people and seeing that they're not stereotypes and finding common grounds and things like that. And think that can then, those experiences can then lead to new shifting theologies and worldviews. Also, I think the other thing that it kind of boils down to when you're talking about people with differing perspectives is what the actual kind of end game or the ultimate goal that they have in mind is, the thing to them that is of most importance. Once you get beyond the rhetoric, once you get beyond the prefabricated answers that is being fed to you by side A or B, the things that are motivating you and the things that logically make sense to you, if you're willing to drop the labels or to maybe even start to distance yourself from the labels, then I think that, one, there's a lot more common ground there, and two, you learn more about yourself and about what's important to you and about what you want to invest your energy in as far as interacting with other people and with just improving yourself, I guess.
Yeah. So. Yeah, don't forget the poor. I mean, that was great that was the one thing that James and Peter and John and Paul could all remember is like, hey, we could do this together. You know, I was kind of really hoping that would be like the thing that brought Republicans and Democrats together would be the kids in cages. I thought, this is going to do it. And it didn't. Oh, well.
I'm sorry, did you say that you talked to some people about possibly helping to provide some?
I did.
And whatever happened with that?
They said it was too overwhelming to do and that there was too many people. I mean, it was, yeah. There was justifications of why they couldn't do it. You know, I couldn't do it because I didn't have enough money, and they couldn't do it because logistics, or the fact that they just
didn't want to do it.
Didn't feel that they really wanted to do it. Yeah, I could talk about that stuff for too long. In the book I'm working on, I'm going to talk about some of that stuff because I think it's interesting how we choose to also not see the faults of our own sides. And I see that on both sides as well, and I think that's something important to look at in the future. But, hey, thank you guys for a great service. We've got a meeting to talk more about the church and hopefully some exciting brand new things coming your way. So me and Caleb have a meeting to go to talk about the church and figure out how to make it better. So I want to thank everybody for joining us on Facebook Live, and we're going to try to continue to do this and make it better. Also, I forgot. Yeah, if Revolution is a non-denominational church, a 501c3 nonprofit, if you'd like to donate to the church, people love this part. This will be the clip that people show. You can donate to Revolution by going to revolutionchurch.com and clicking on the donate button. That's how we exist. This is how we do stuff like this. I mean, through your donations, we're able to have a tripod because someone gave it to us. This video is on my own cell phone, so we could really use your help and support. My kids just poured water on my computer, and I don't have a computer now, so hey, we could use your help. So we'd also like to hire Caleb because Caleb helps make all this stuff happen, and he works really hard. He works really hard doing this to make this happen, and then he works really hard to make money outside of this, and I'd like to see him be able to bring those two loves together. So if you want to consider helping Revolution and supporting us financially, please go to revolutionchurch.com and make a donation there. Thank you, everybody, and lots of love and grace. Bye.
We'd like to remind you that our ministry is supported 100% by listeners like you. To make your 100% tax-deductible donation today, please visit revolutionchurch.com/donate. You can also learn more by clicking the donate section on the website.
If you enjoyed this show, you might also like Loosen the Bible Belt with Kristen Becker and myself, Jay Baker. RuPaul had me out to a show when I was out in LA, and I got to meet a lot of different drag queens, and it's amazing how much my mother has been an inspiration to a lot of drag queens, because I think my mom has always portrayed kind of an over-the-top feminine thing too. In a way, my mom was a woman in drag, trying to be even more feminine and more women that she felt that she had to be to go against the grain that she was raised. I've always seen kind of this kind of strange crossroads with my mother and the whole drag scene. So it's always been something I've always really kind of loved and actually been pretty comfortable with, which I think was strange for a lot of my hetero friends.
Yeah. Well, it goes without saying, I adore your mother.
Oh, thank you.
And to this day, of course. And if you can imagine the brunette version, that would be my mother. So, essentially, lots of extra makeup and hair and clothes and shoulder pads. And, in the 80s, she wore those Dynasty power suits.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, for my wedding, she had 3 costume changes and told me I look much better than the bride. Just saying.
That was a Post-Christian podcast.